Church, let's grab our Bibles. We are in Revelation chapter 3 this morning. I'd like for you to stand with me if you're able to do so. We're going to read verses 7 through 13 together as a church, which comprises the letter to the church in the city of Philadelphia. We stand, of course, at Gospel Fellowship not to try to be religious or anything like that, but simply to be reminded that God's Word is infallible, that it is inerrant, that it is the inspired Word of the true and living God. So let's listen to this text as though God himself were speaking to us audibly, such as the authority of God's written word. Revelation chapter 3, verse 7, "And to the angel of the church in Philadelphia write, the words of the Holy One, the true One, who has the key of David, who opens and no one will shut, who shuts and no one opens. I know your works. Behold, I have set before you an open door, which no one is able to shut. I know that you have but little power, and yet you have kept my word and have not denied my name. Behold, I will make those of the synagogue of Satan who say that they are Jews and are not, but lie. Behold, I will make them come and bow down before your feet, and they will learn that I have loved you." Verse 10, "Because you have kept my word about patient endurance, I will keep you from the hour of trial that is coming on the whole world, to try those who dwell on the earth. I am coming soon. Hold fast to what you have, so that no one may seize your crown." Verse 12, "The one who conquers, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God. Never shall he go out of it. And I will write on him the name of my God, and the name of the city of my God, the new Jerusalem, which comes down from my God out of heaven, and my own new name. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches." May God add his blessing to the reading of his holy word. Amen. You may be seated. You know that desperate feeling that you get when you can't find your keys? You never lose your keys when you've got an hour. You always lose your keys when you're already 3 minutes late, right? You search everywhere and you check every pocket. I have a backpack I carry around to most places. I have to check every single pouch. There's like 22 pouches in the backpack. I've got to look everywhere. Run out to the car, maybe they're in the key, maybe they're in the ignition somewhere, and they're usually not. And then in the desperate gambits, in my most needful moment, I call out to my wife. And my wife, as many wives do, she has 200 terabytes of knowledge in her brain about every object that we've ever owned in our entire lives. And she'll say to me, "Your keys are right here. They're on the table, right where you left them," right? They're always on the table. That's where they all are. Keys are an interesting symbol, aren't they, if you think about it? They are that which locks and prevents. And we need that. We need that locking, preventing power that keys have to keep us safe from danger and from threats and from strangers. And yet at the same time, ironically, keys have the power to grant access, to permit, and to welcome. And so keys have that sort of twofold preventing and admitting power. And we're going to talk a little bit about that this morning, whether keys are passwords or whether they're swipe cards or whether they're literally the metal things that dangle from our ignition. We need keys in our lives. And the book of Revelation is not short on keys as well. In fact, we're going to talk about one of those keys in some detail this morning when we get to that particular verse. Let's just very quickly take our Bibles, and I hope you'll do this with me. Let's survey the 4 keys that are mentioned in the book of Revelation. Then we're going to focus in on the one that's in our text here, particularly this morning. There's at least 4 keys. Maybe you can point out some others to me if I've missed any. But in chapter 1, in the vision of Christ, that glorious, wonderful vision, that awe-inspiring vision that causes John to fall down in fear, we're told in verse 18 of chapter 1 that he is the living one who died, and behold, he says, "I am alive forevermore, and I have the keys of death and Hades." Plural keys mentioned there. But these keys open death and Hades. Undoubtedly, this is a reference to his own resurrection. Jesus is the one who broke the power of death and the grave, mentioned there in that text. In our text here in chapter 3, in verse 7, the key is slightly differently described. It says, "The key of David, who opens and no one will shut, and who shuts no one will open." We're going to look at that because there's an Old Testament reference there that may surprise you. It surprised me as I studied the passage this week to try to be able to explain these things to you. In chapter 9, there's another key mentioned. This one is mentioned twice, if I'm not mistaken. In chapter 9, verse 1, it says, "The fifth angel blew his trumpet, and I saw a star fallen from heaven to earth, and he was given the key," listen, "to the shaft of the bottomless pit." A powerful key, no doubt. It's the same key, I think, that's mentioned again in chapter 20, and one of the most difficult passages to interpret in the entire book. We're going to spend some time trying to unfold chapter 20 because this is a very difficult text. But in chapter 20, verse 1, I think that same key is mentioned. "Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. And he seized the dragon, that ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years." Certainly the most controversial verse in all the book, right there, in verse 3 or 2 or 3 of Revelation chapter 20. So we're going to look at the key that we have before us this morning. Before we do that, though, I wanted to simply mention a few things about the city of Philadelphia, the church in the city of Philadelphia. You know, this is the 6th of 7 churches in the letters that are written to them that we're looking at. I mentioned initially when we started this little mini-series within the book that these 7 letters create sort of a chiasmus, where there's a pattern to the 7 letters. So the first letter and the 7th letter, if you can kind of visualize, are the churches that are in spiritual danger. We're going to come back to Laodicea next week and see their danger of lukewarmth. We already mentioned Ephesus, of course, in the first. And then churches 2 and 6, those are the churches that are in the strongest spiritual position, relatively speaking. And so this church this morning in Philadelphia, you should know, there is no critique of this church at all. No words of condemnation to them. No severe warnings, really. The church in Philadelphia, all things considered, is in a strong spiritual position. Thank goodness. And then churches 3, 4, and 5, those churches are kind of middling. They have their strengths, they have their weaknesses. We've already covered those churches. I should tell you, though, that the city of Philadelphia is interestingly placed because these churches, as they go around in a clockwise manner, the city of Philadelphia is the furthest inland of all of the churches that we're going to study. And that's important because the roads from the port cities go through Philadelphia into the inland areas of Asia Minor. And so there is sort of a key, pun obviously intended, position there geographically so that the ports would connect to the inland and the inland would have to go through Philadelphia to bring things out to the port. Now, Philadelphia, one more thing, or a couple more things that's interesting. You already know the meaning of the name because we have a city called Philadelphia here. It's the city of brotherly love. It wasn't originally talking about Christian love, though, as we may think of it. It was originally named by an ancient ruler called Eumenes. You don't need to remember that. Who named the city for his own brother Attalus. But here's what's interesting. In AD 17, the city of Philadelphia was shaken by a tremendous earthquake, did major damage in that city. Many of the buildings fell down. Many of the homes were destroyed. And because of the damage in the city of Philadelphia, the emperor Tiberius actually granted them a tax reprieve, right? And the city of Philadelphia responded to their emperor in gratitude by, guess what? Installing the emperor-worshiping cult there. And so they became an emperor-worshiping city because of the handouts, let's say, that the emperor granted to them. That's going to come back to us in just a little bit when we work through this text together. So I have 2 points for you this morning. They're very easy to write down if you want to keep track in your outline or your notes. First of all, we're going to talk about the fact that the city of Philadelphia, the church in the city of Philadelphia has, according to Christ, little power. That's not a condemnation, but it's a fact. They have little power. We're going to discuss what that means first. And then secondly, towards the end of the message, I also want to discuss the fact that they do have, though, lasting influence. So little power, according to the world, but lasting influence for the name of Christ. So that's the outline. Let's get our Bibles out again this morning. I hope you have the passage open right with you so you can follow along with me as I teach through this. Let's just start, number 1, in observing the little power that they have. Look at verse 8. He says, Christ speaking here, "I know your works. Behold, I have set before you an open door which no one is able to shut. And I know," Jesus says, "that you have but little power, and yet you have kept my word and have not denied my name." Now, I think that it's worthy of mention that Christ says to this church that he knows their works, and then he does not follow that by any sort of critique. Okay, there's no condemnation here. from Christ to this church. And I think this is important because if, as we were studying these 7 letters, you kind of began to get the feeling that Jesus is never pleased with his church, but he's always picking on it, I don't want you to think that. It's not true. When Christ critiques his church, he always does so because the spiritual dangers are real, but it's not because he is some impossible-to-please boss who is constantly looking over your shoulder and is never pleased with what you do for him. That's not true. He is a Lord who loves us. In fact, the love of Christ for his church is mentioned specifically in this letter right here. So I don't want you to feel like that in your own personal life, that you can never do anything to make Jesus happy, that he's always critiquing you, that he's always concerned, that he's always warning you. Not true. This week we had a chance to see the play Annie, which was awesome at one of the local schools. We had several kids from Gospel Fellowship that were starring in the play Annie, and as I was thinking about how the play works, you have Miss Hannigan, who's never pleased. She's constantly picking on the orphans. You get the sense she doesn't even like them, right? And yet Daddy Warbucks has a heart that is filled with love, and all he wants is to call Annie to his side and adopt her into his own home. That's the story of the play. It's a gospel story. Have you ever noticed that? It's just a telling of the gospel. And Jesus is far more like Daddy Warbucks, who loves his adopted daughter, than he is Miss Hannigan, who's constantly displeased and annoyed by her children over which she is the custodian. I don't want you to think, as we're studying these letters, that Jesus is constantly picking on his church. Not true. He loves the church. The reasons he gives us the warnings is because he loves us, right? It's because he loves us. Now, what does he say next here? He says, "Behold, I have set before you an open door." This may be a geographical reference to the idea, again, that the city of Philadelphia is uniquely positioned as sort of a gateway city to the interior and to the ports. Now, here in Pittsburgh, we kind of understand that because Pittsburgh is also uniquely positioned in the confluence of the Allegheny and the Monongahela rivers leading into the Ohio. We, too, have that kind of unique geographical position in which we have influence inland into the interior of the continent. The church of Philadelphia had the same. It could be that when Jesus says, "I set before you an open door," he may mean either A, that the door he has opened is his death and resurrection, so that we too may come through this open door of the gospel. It's like when Jesus rose from the dead, he bolted the door of the gospel open so that all might come in, right? And yet, it's also a possibility here that this is actually a reference to evangelism. Maybe what Jesus is saying here, and it could be both, right? These are not mutually exclusive. It could be that what Jesus is saying here is you have an open door to evangelize both this way and that way. Okay? So these are all good things for the sake of the church. Now, let's come to that line, though, that you might have thought was a critique. I don't think it's a critique. I think it's just a statement of fact. It doesn't come across as a compliment necessarily, but, well, we'll deal with it. So what does Jesus say here in verse 8? He says, "I know that you have but little power, and yet you have kept my word and have not denied my name." What does Jesus mean when he says the church has little power? Well, let's throw out some options, shall we? Maybe he means money. Maybe he's talking finances here. Money's power, yes? Do we agree with that? Certainly is. Money is power. Money is the ability to leverage financial obligations or opportunities to the personal benefit. And we would all like to have money because money gives us opportunities to do things. It's money that acquires property. It's money that builds cities. It's money that constructs armies. It's money that advances technology and feeds the mouths of the hungry. Maybe what Jesus is saying here is you have little power because you have little money. You think? Maybe? Well, it's certainly advantageous when the church is not in poverty, but I'll tell you this. If everything that we have right now, Gospel Fellowship, was taken away from us, we would still meet next week out in the field, wouldn't we? Amen. Yes, we would. We'd be outside in the cold, and I'd be standing here with the same book in my hand, and we'd go on to the very next text, because whether we're rich or whether we're poor does not matter, cannot stop the church. Okay? Now, maybe he's talking about military power. That would make sense here in context as well. But it's pretty clear that the church isn't supposed to be a military power regardless. Because what does Paul say? Paul says, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, and against the spiritual forces of evil and the heavenly places." We cannot really even concoct in our minds a situation in which the church is supposed to take up military arms and do that kind of warfare, right? That power, the power of the sword, is clearly given to the state, at least according to Romans chapter 13, verse 4. Yeah? Maybe he's talking about magisterial power, or the power of the government, that the church has very little power when it comes to civil or civic government. Now, maybe some of you are a little bit disappointed with the elections. I don't know where you stand on these things. I'm not going to ask. All I will say to you is certainly this: there are times where we wish, as the church, that the state would heed our warnings to them, right? We wish that our prophetic powers to be able to speak a word of rebuke to the state were heeded more often than they are. Unfortunately, very frequently that is not the case. We don't always have the civil power, the magisterial power that we sometimes wish we had. I'll tell you this. Part of me wishes that David and I were elected the state senators of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. I think we do a pretty good job, David and I, right? But we weren't on the ballot. Okay, apparently you have to sign up to get on the ballot somehow. We didn't know, we didn't make it. I would think that the elders of this church might do a pretty good job if we were the representatives of this commonwealth, but that's not the way it works. The church, listen carefully, does not have the power to pass laws or execute magisterial decrees or install kings or inflict just war or veto the Senate or raise taxes. That's not the kind of power that we have as the church. And I will tell you this, here's food for thought on your way home. Even the Reformation, which was one of the greatest revivals that the history of the world has ever seen, was not able to produce a church-state amalgam that true Christians didn't have to flee on a boat generations later. So we have to be very careful that we don't confuse the power of the church with that of the state. That's why whenever the church and the state get too intermingled with one another, you usually end up with a very nominal and inept church. The kind of church that the Puritans had to preach against. The kind of church that the Pilgrims had to flee on a boat, right? The kind of church that Kierkegaard and others lamented as pathetically weak. And so it's not the power of the magisterium here that we're supposed to be questing after. So we might say something like this: the Church of Philadelphia lacked what kind of power? They lacked the kind of power that the unbelieving world craves and wars to defend. The Church of Philadelphia did not have that kind of power, but that's not to say that they were entirely powerless, because read the rest of the verse. There's a different kind of power here, a power that I think is better, a power that I think is higher. Jesus says, "I know that you have but little power, yet you have kept my word and have not denied my name." That's the power I want. You say, "Everhard, you're power hungry." Yes, I am. I'm power hungry. I want the power to not deny the word and to keep his name. That's what I want. That's what I want for us. Because every other force that's around us is going to conspire against us to shut us up from preaching prophetically against the evils that we see in this world. So, mark this down. Think about it. The secular world, the temptations of your flesh, even the apostasy of false brethren, right? All of these powers, the power of the devil, he is going to exert all of his influence to try to force the church to clench her jaws shut so that she doesn't speak a prophetic word, to still the tongue of the gospel-preaching church. But as long as we continue to preach freely and boldly, we have the kind of power, not the kind of power the world wants, but we have this verse 8 power, which is the power to keep his word and to not deny his name. That's exactly what I want. I want the kind of power for this church and for all Bible-believing churches, not just this pulpit, but all pulpits. We want the power that tanks and banks and kings and threats and crosses and arenas and prisons and stakes cannot take from us. That's what we want. We want that invincible, Holy Spirit-inspired power that is worth more than all the thrones and the dominions that this world has to offer to us. So we don't compromise. We will boldly proclaim the name, and therefore we will become more like the Church of Philadelphia. Now, let's go on to this interesting reference about the keys. I was blown away by this. I didn't see this coming whenever I study to prepare for a sermon. I'm often surprised where the Bible takes me because it goes sometimes where I wasn't expecting to go. I think I know the interpretation of these things, and then you study it a little bit and find out that something is surprising here. Such was the case with verse 7 for me. So let's look at the key. It's called here, he is called the true one who has the key of David, who opens and no one will shut, and who shuts and no one opens. Now, as you know, the key to the book of Revelation, again, pun clearly intended, I'm sorry, is the Old Testament, not the newspaper, right? This is how we interpret this book? So there's one passage that is clearly the referent here, the key of the house of David that opens and no one shuts, that shuts and no one opens. And we've already read that passage this morning in our earlier text from Isaiah chapter 22. But even that passage has a surprise. Let's go back there. Let's go back to our supplementary reading today from Isaiah chapter 22. And look at this key in context here. Now, this passage is a bit mystifying, but I think I can unfold it in a way that may be helpful. Look at this. Let's start in verse 20. And that day I will call my servant Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, and I will clothe him with your robe and bind your sash on him. Now that's interesting because we saw the robe and the sash from that vision of Christ in chapter 1, verses 9 to 20 in the book of Revelation. And I will commit your authority to his hand, and he shall be a father to the inhabitants of Jerusalem and to the house of Judah. And here we go. I will place on his shoulder the key of the house of David. There's our exact reference. He shall open and none shall shut, and he shall shut and none shall open. Now pause right there. Why does Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, get that power? Better question. Who in the world is Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah? Raise your hand if you know. If you know, you can preach the rest of the sermon. Nobody knows? I didn't know. I should have known, but I forgot. Because Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, we covered him when we studied the book of Isaiah months ago. Now, let me refresh your memory here. Very important. I need you to hang with me. Okay? Book of Isaiah. Let's go back. Two powers try to conquer the people of God. You have Assyria, who comes in 722 BC, and they destroy the northern kingdom, right? Kingdom of Assyria. Later, Babylon comes. They exile the southern kingdom of Judah in 586 BC. And Isaiah has the unfortunate responsibility to preach against warning of Assyria coming and Babylon coming. He's got a very inglorious responsibility as a prophet. Now, one major moment, and I know you're going to remember this because I remember it for sure, was in 701 BC. There's a story told to us when Assyria tried to take the city of Jerusalem. Do you remember this? And you'll remember this because, well, let's flip to it. Let's go to Isaiah chapter 36. I promise this is all going to make sense in just a moment. In Isaiah chapter 36, Sennacherib, he's going to get greedy and he's going to come down and to try to take Jerusalem and Judah as well in a siege attempt that fails in 701 BC. Now, the reason you're going to remember this passage is because do you remember that time that Sennacherib and his messenger, the Rabshakeh, they literally come up to the walls in Jerusalem and they begin to mock. You remember this? They mock them and they scold the believers and they say to them things like this: no God has ever stopped the mighty Assyrian army. Why would you think that your measly God, the God of the Jews, is going to be able to do what none of the other gods can do in stopping our invincible army? And you'll remember that line where the Rabshakeh says, soon you are going to be eating your own filth. Do you remember that? So who in the world is Eliakim? Well, he was one of three men that the king sent out to go to stand on the wall. There's Eliakim, there's Shebna, and there's Joah. And Eliakim is always mentioned first, and that little triad of these three men. And so these three men, they go out to the wall, and if you remember the story, you can read it later for your family time or your devotions this afternoon. They are the subjects of this mockery and this scorn. And their duty is to simply stand there on the face of the wall and to receive all of this malevolence, to receive all of this hatred, to receive all of these mocking taunts from the unbelieving world towards the city of God. And then they faithfully go back. And what do? They tell King Hezekiah, and they go straight to Isaiah the prophet, and Isaiah the prophet prays. And then do you remember what happens? Do you remember the story? I know you're going to remember this. Because when you flip over to chapter 37, what happens next? It says in 37:36, and the angel of the Lord went out and struck down 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. They did not need to fight because God struck down their enemies on their behalf. And the Assyrians lie baking in the sun and being eaten by the wild animals. Eliakim has the key to the house of David because he is boldly courageous in facing down all the pagan powers, willing to accept all of the mockery into the scorn for the sake of the people of God. And what we're told here in Revelation, to put this all together, let's make 2 and 2 make 4 here. Jesus Christ has the key of David. He is the one who opens and no one will shut. He is the one who shuts and no one will open. Jesus Christ has the key of David because he is the one who has received all of the scorn, all of the mockery, all of the hatred of the unbelieving world into himself. And yet, for our sakes, he delivers us and he calls us his own and he saves us from this certain calamity. And so, church, we are not to seek the little power that this world wants, the power of people like Rabshakeh and like Sennacherib. No, instead, the kind of power that we want is not to control armies and levy taxes and launch missiles and annex lands. The power that we have is the power of Eliakim, who simply stands faithful on the wall and holds up the book and says, we will not compromise for the name of our God. He will deliver us. This is the open door that no one can shut. This is the closed door that no one can open. It is the Word of God. And Christ, we are told, has this key. Now watch what happens here when the church doesn't try to do what it's not supposed to do and instead does what it is supposed to do, which is to proclaim the Word and the sacrament. Look at verse 9. This is good stuff. Behold, I will make those of the synagogue of Satan who say that they are Jews and are not, but lie. Behold, I will make them come and bow down before your feet, and they will learn that I have loved you. Now, given what we just read about God himself, the angel of the Lord slaying the 185,000 Assyrians, there might be part of us that is in the mood to see our enemies stomped. But don't go there. Because this too is a reference to the book of Isaiah. And in the book of Isaiah, there are 3 times where it says that the enemies will come down and bow down at your feet. Okay? Isaiah 45:14, Isaiah 49:23, and Isaiah 60:14. And in each one of those occasions, the enemies come to bow down at the feet, not because they're being destroyed, but because God has moved in their hearts to save them, ironically. That's right, look it up. Look at Isaiah chapter 60. Let's do this very, very quickly. Isaiah 60 is the most glorious and hopeful prophecy that God and his gospel are going to go out and they're going to pervade all of the nations. Isaiah 63, the nations shall come into your light and the kings into the brightness of your rising. All of this here is picturing the nations coming to Christ. And then what it says in verse 14, the sons of those who afflicted you, your very enemies, what are they going to do? They're going to come bending low to you, and all who despised you shall bow down at your feet, and they shall call you the city of the Lord, the city of Zion, the Holy One of Israel. Now somebody says, well, that certainly sounds like a metaphor of conquering and victory to me. If I'm standing here and my enemies are bowing down at my feet, doesn't that mean I've beat them? Not if you're bowing down too. If you're bowing down too, what's happened is they've come to worship with you. And so what Revelation chapter 3 is actually telling us here is that God is going to rescue even some, not all, but some of the very worst who have despised the name of Christ, who have participated in the synagogue of Satan. In other words, the gospel is so glorious that even some of them will be rescued and bow down before the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. It's actually a hopeful passage. That's why it says they're going to know what? That I've loved you. And so the irony here is that Isaiah, he's prophesying a time when the Gentiles will worship with the Jews. Irony being here in Revelation, we're talking about Jews coming to worship now with the Gentile Christian church. This may be a reference to what Paul's talking about in Romans chapter 11. All right? Now, all of that I take to be very good and hopeful news here. But let's go on then secondly, and I promise I'll be shorter on this point, to look at the lasting influence then of those who stand for the Word of God and do not compromise the faith. Look at what he promises here. Now, there's a whole string of promises here, like pearls on a necklace. But I want to mention the one in verse 12 today. Look at this. Let's read the verse. The one who conquers. Okay, and how do you conquer? Through war? No, we just talked about that. You conquer through holding fast to his name. That's how we conquer. The one who conquers, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God. Never shall he go out of it, and I will write on him the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, the New Jerusalem, which comes down from my God out of heaven, and my own name. You'll be a pillar, he says. Now, one of the great things about studying these letters, and we've noted this almost every week for the last 6 weeks, is that in each one of the letters, there's something that is particularly said for the certain circumstances and the unique circumstances of that particular city. Okay? It's not just like incidental language flying around here, but Christ is very particular with the rewards and the warnings that he offers to each church. Here, the reward is that you will be a pillar in his temple. Let me go back to that earthquake they experienced. I want you to think about this. This is powerful. So in AD 17, as I mentioned, the city of Philadelphia began to shake. It began to crumble. They didn't have the architectural designs and the strength that we build into our buildings today. We make earthquake-resistant buildings today. It's great. Okay, but in that world, when the earthquake shook, anything could be leveled. And it was. It was so bad that the emperor had to grant them a tax reprieve so that they could just survive. And what did they do in Philadelphia? What did they do? They began to worship the emperor in thanks to him rather than to God because of this government-sponsored tax credit handout. Statism and free gifts and emperor worship go together pretty well. So be careful with that. But what Christ is promising here is that you will be a pillar in the temple of my God if you hold fast to his name. Let's think about the pillar for just a moment. We still use pillars in our architectural designs. 3 reasons. Number 1, because pillars have incredible load-bearing capacity, right? They are designed by strength because they are resting on the foundation. Therefore, they can hold tons, dozens of tons, hundreds of tons worth of weight upon them. Pillars are designed for strength. Secondly, pillars have what we might call endurance or longevity. Now, I want you to do this just for a moment here. A little thought experiment. I want you to, right now, picture in your mind a city with ancient ruins. You don't have to close your eyes if that's weird or anything. I want you to picture Rome, or Athens, or Troy, or whatever other ancient city you want to. Picture in your mind a city of ancient ruins. What do you see? What's left? The pillars. Like the one thing that doesn't fall down. It's the one thing that seems to have this unshakable endurance to them. And so pillars are built for weight-bearing capacity. They're built incredibly strong. They have this the strange ability of endurance, and then finally we use them to beautify our structures because they're very attractive and beautiful. In fact, this idea here of naming the pillars. You say, that's kind of a mixed metaphor. No, it's not. You name pillars here because in the Old Testament, when we look at the description of the temple of God itself, the pillars there have names too. 1 Kings chapter 7. Okay. In 1 Kings chapter 7, the pillars of the temple itself have names. Jachin, which means he establishes, and Boaz, which means strength. Jachin, he establishes, Boaz, strength. When you hold fast to the name, when you do not deny his word, you will be made pillars, unshakably strong, in the temple of our God.